A lot of people have been asking me to look at the second game in the third and fourth place playoff between Magnus Carlsen and Vladimir Fedoseev from the Fide World Cup. So I'm very happy to oblige. It's just taken me some time to get around to it. A lot going on at the moment. Been commentating on Chess 24 on the latest Champions Chess Tour event. But yeah, definitely want to look at this game. If you remember, the first classical game between these two was a spectacular win for Carlsen. Beautiful exchange sacrifice. And this second classical game was also an absolute treat. So a Caro-Kann on the board. Now remember, Carlsen only needs a draw to win this match. But, you know, he said at the start of this World Cup that basically he wanted to just test himself in classical chess. You know, just dip his toe in the water to see how he was feeling, what his form is. So instead of just playing something really solid, a classical main line with knight c3 or exchanging on d5, he played e5. Now this is a real test. This is the hottest battleground in the Caro-Kann at the moment at the top level. Leads to incredibly complex positions. Of course, it's ambitious because white is claiming space. Knight f3, probably the most popular move in this position. But Carlsen goes for c4. It is a move that he's experimented with in the past. Knight c3 and knight e7 is the most popular move here, but Fedoseev goes for bishop b4. Takes on d5, and now queen takes d5. Knight e2 is a comparatively new move, apparently, so we're already in slightly obscure lines, but I mean, in a sense, it's a familiar kind of position. Once again, you know, this pawn structure for white gives white space, and black sometimes tries to use that d5 square for minor pieces. So the queen came all the way back, anticipating this move a3, and instead of exchanging, bishop a5, holding that dark squared bishop, so looking perhaps to play to b6, maybe to put some pressure on this pawn. Knight g3, hitting the bishop, which is protected, and bishop c4, just covering that d5 square. Looks like that bishop doesn't have any future on this square, because, of course, you know, with the pawns on f7 and e6, it blocks out that bishop. But wait and see. Bishop back and h4. So white continuing this pawn advance, you know, just claiming more space. Of course, if h5, blocking that h-pawn, that gives white a really nice square on g5. So, as is so often the case, black has a little bit of a dilemma. You know, what do you do about this pawn advance? Well, not possible to leave it really, because h5 looks really nice for white, and potentially h6. So black goes for h6, which seems correct. Bishop tucks itself away, but you can see that these pawns have carved out territory for white on the king side, which Carlsen exploits straight away with queen g4, and this is highly unpleasant. The move that black wants to make, of course, is castle's king side, but bishop takes pawn, so black has to compromise here. This is unpleasant. So king f8, and you could say that, well, Carlsen has already achieved something here, and castle's king side. So this is the basic problem for black. That the king is on f8. That means the rooks are not going to be able to connect. Split rooks, yeah, that's the age-old problem. And white has very nice options here. Black develops knight e4, of course. You know, you use that space that you've carved out with e5 to give that knight a beautiful square on e4 and potentially looking at d6. So therefore bishop c7 covers. Bishop a2 just preempts any hit. Knight f5. But black does have some control over these light squares here, and a potential target on d4. So, you know, as is typical in the Caro-Kann, black can counterattack here and hope that white has actually overextended. So this knight is a troublesome beast, but what happens if black exchanges? I should say that Fedoseev played queen e7 here, but what about taking and playing knight b6? You know, that's the kind of thing you want to do, put the knight on d5, but here white has f4. And we can see that this is white's big plan, f5. Blasting open the f-file through to black's king, and that is incredibly dangerous. So black has to take care. Queen e7. Knight comes back to g3, hitting the bishop, which moves away. Queen g4. Right. So Carlsen has shuffled the pieces, and he's back on track again. And we can see the idea once again. f4, f5, and the king is at the end of the f-file where white is attacking, and suddenly that bishop, which you sort of thought, well, it looks a bit redundant on this diagonal, actually, once the pawn gets to f5, we see it's in the perfect position to put pressure on the e6 pawn, and black's king looks in a really sorry state there. So black desperately needs counterplay. Fedoseev played c5, trying to undermine white's pawn center. So position's getting rather delicate now, and this needs some really nice touches from Carlsen. Otherwise, if that e5 pawn drops, then the king can find some safety. So nice move from Carlsen. Bishop d2. So obviously if pawn takes pawn, then bishop takes, and that could be very awkward for the king. So rook d8 from Fedoseev, and that means that Carlsen can continue with his strategy. Pawn to f4, so he's just continuing like this. So if pawn takes pawn, let's just see what would happen. This didn't happen. Pawn takes pawn, bishop b4, that bishop's just slicing through the position. Knight c5 and f5. So white just continues on. It's such a straightforward plan. Takes here, here, and g7 drops. End of game. So this is the issue. Pawn to f5. So what can black do? Knight b6. So Fedoseev is fighting. So that means he'll be able to take on d4 with the rook, potentially, which, well, after f5, rook d4, you can see the queen would be hit, the bishop would be hit. Not so clear. So bishop c3, another little delicate step from Carlsen. And he is still getting ready for f5. Knight d5 played. Now that could be taken and f5 anyway, but Carlsen decides he doesn't want to give up that beautiful bishop. Pawn to f5. Knight e3. Hitting the queen and the rook. So knight 4. So Carlsen is happy to give up the exchange. Now here Fedoseev took on f5. But what about knight takes rook? Well, simply rook takes. You'll notice every single one of white's pieces is active, is joining in the attack. And yeah, at the end of the f-file is that king. And this is simply too much for black to bear. Tremendous compensation. You know, there could be pawn number 2 arriving in this position as well. d5 is on its way after an exchange. So instead of taking the rook, Fedoseev decided to take that pawn on f5. Well, just for the moment, it looks like black has, well, averted the immediate danger, let's put it like that. However, watch what happens. Carlsen, of course, had this planned. d5. It's remarkable looking at this game how straightforward white's play is. You know, he's just pushing pawns all over the board here and just using that space advantage. I think the thing is, when you play a system like this, you need to calculate incredibly well, and you need to hold your nerve. You know, if you back down for a moment, then black will be in. Black can counterattack. Black actually has quite a strong, solid pawn structure, so you mustn't let the initiative go. But this is very strong. Of course, if that's taken, the bishop drops. And d6 threatened. So bishop b6. With potential to check here, blocking out the bishop. So bishop c4, very nice containing move from Carlsen, just shutting out black's pieces. It's a really nice move. If pawn takes pawn, then queen takes, and e6, another pawn advance. And this is crushing. If f6, you can just crash through. Queen takes, and, well, let's say queen g6, you can take the queen. Pawn takes, queen here, and this is going to win. Let's come back here. King g8, d6, queen h4, hitting the bishop. And now b3. Rook d7. So white needs to find a way to break into the position. You know, it's fascinating, this, actually. You know, black has defensive chances here with bishop e4, and, you know, if bishop here, then the bishop can maybe bounce around here. So it's not over yet. Queen e2, that's a little delicate move from Carlsen again. Just preempting that move, bishop e4. So queen g4 played, and now an absolutely spectacular finish from Carlsen. Rook takes bishop. So if pawn takes rook, you take, and e6. And white crashes through. And queen takes is the game continuation. Rook f1. And now that queen gets pushed away. Bishop d2. Queen d8. Queen g4. So once again the queen takes up this aggressive position. And it's very hard for black to find a defense, because basically black is just cut in two. This rook will never get into the game and never connects with these pieces, and it is just too much for black. Here Fedoseev played a6. Let's just have a look at what happens after queen e8. I mean, white has a few options here. There is bishop b5. There's bishop e3 just to keep black bottled up. Another nice move, rook f6, with the idea of taking here. Lots of beautiful options. But anyway, a6 played, and now Carlsen crashed in, rook f7. Absolutely crushing. Let's just see the game continuation. So, I mean, black doesn't have a defensive. Check. So Carlsen just repeated the position and played e6. Which is a beautiful position for white. I mean, black really doesn't have a move here. Obviously, rook takes pawn, queen f7 mate, queen f6, and, you know, a lot of forlorn hope from black trying to exchange queens. But after this, a really comical position, because that rook cannot escape. The king can't move up. All these squares are covered. The rook can't move. I mean, it's just an amazing position. And so once again, Carlsen has managed to completely dominate his opponent's pieces, just like in the first classical game. And the game finished like this. Bishop e6. Now this is important, because that rook is trying to get out. but to no avail. After h4, bishop g4 shuts the rook in. Still can't do anything. And of course, if h3 you take with the pawn, the rook's still shut in. b5 played, king f3, b4 takes, and here actually Fedoseev resigned. Okay, why did he resign? Let's have a look. Well, like I said before, the king really doesn't have a decent move, can only come to g8. The rook can't get out, all these squares are covered. So what does white do? Let's march the king up to f5. And if rook h6, well, it doesn't do anything. Bishop g5, exchange off the bishops, and that's the d pawn is going home. Or if a4, you can try and get a bit tricky on the other side of the board. No problem. These pieces have everything under control, and we can push that pawn here. Take. I mean, of course there are many ways to win this, but I'm just showing one particular way. Followed by making a queen, and then that one will roll home. So there's simply no need to actually capture the rook. So let me just show the final position again. That's the final position, and black is absolutely paralyzed again. Brilliant from Magnus Carlsen. So I just find it so interesting that, you know, essentially he didn't need to play for a win here, but he wanted to test himself. He played the sharpest line against the Caro-Kann, and he played it in a really ambitious way with h4 and, you know, these exchange sacrifices. I repeat, he didn't need to go in for something like this, but he wanted to test himself. And, well, we saw he's in pretty good form. Thanks very much for watching. Don't forget, like, comment, share and subscribe. I really want to try and hit 100k. It's a nominal milestone, but I'd still like to get there. So if you're not a subscriber, then please do subscribe to the channel and click the bell for instant notifications. And do consider supporting us via PayPal or Patreon. Thanks for watching.